in the Lawrence area for a while now. Used to practice here in Lawrence and then had other opportunities come up. So I'm down in Ottawa now, but I have been brewing beer since basically I started college. Here at KU. So I went to KU. So I hope that this will be informative for you and everybody will enjoy. I want to just kind of give a disclaimer. What I'm going to present to you today is sort of my interpretation of lots of different sources. I've read lots of books on brewing. Primarily, the sort of the primary source that I used when I started was a book written by a man named Charlie Papazian called The Joy of Homebrewing. And Charlie Papazian is a really interesting, cool guy. He was a chemist of some variety, a chemical physicist or something. I can't remember what he started off as, but what he became was the man who founded the American Homebrewers Association. And he has lived in Boulder for many, many years. And how I sort of came to all of this was I had a friend who was a graduate student at KU in college who was a very accomplished home brewer. And he kind of got me interested in it. And when I started doing it, I discovered that my uncle was also a home brewer. And I didn't know that. And it turns out that my uncle learned how to brew from Charlie Papazian. And because I brought up this book and my uncle said, yeah, that's Charlie. I know Charlie. I said, what do you mean you know Charlie? And he said, oh, I've partied with Charlie. A lot. So I was like, oh, interesting. So I was fortunate enough to meet Charlie Papazian at the Great American Beer Festival in Denver, which is held every year. I went for about 4 years in a row. And the Great American Beer Festival is this magical place where thousands of breweries come together and let you sample their beer, which basically turns into a big drunk fest. But I was interested in it from the perspective of a brewer, and what they also do is they put on classes. And so you could go and learn how to taste beer and how they judge beer and that sort of thing. And then they had classes on food pairings with beer. They would have classes on growing hops and water and how chemistry of water affects beer. And I mean, it can get really highly technical if you want, while the other 10,000 people are getting wasted. Basically the moral of that story is I have brewed beer for a long time. I have sampled every style of beer. And I'm by no means an expert in beer, but I have a lot of experience with it. So, all right. So here are the basics to brewing. Beer is composed of 4 basic ingredients: barley, hops, water, and yeast. Okay. And I forgot to correct my spelling. There's one spelling mistake. I actually did correct it, but it didn't translate into the read-only version. I think it's correct in the rest of the presentation. We'll just go through each of these ingredients and what they do for beer. So when barley is used in brewing, so basically it's harvested and then it goes through a process called malting. Now, malting is basically germinating it. So you get it wet, you spread it out, and you keep it wet until it just starts to sprout. And then once it starts to sprout, you dry it out quickly. And what that does is it liberates all the fermentable sugars in the barley seed. So you know, when it's in its, before it's germinated, it has a whole bunch of starches and things that can't really be utilized by enzymes. So getting it wet, germinating it, the process called malting, prepares those sugars to be ready to be extracted, and then they can be fermented. So most of beer, or most of the barley that's used in beer, is going to be either 2-row or 6-row, and that just refers to the number of seeds along the flowering head of the barley plant. Most people use pretty exclusively 2-row. 6-row has some special properties. It has a little bit different enzymatic profile, so it will add some character to certain beer styles, but by far and away 2-row barley is the main base malt used in brewing. So if you're going to brew a 5-gallon batch of beer, which is the volume that I do, it's going to consist of about somewhere between 10 and 15 pounds of grain when it's all said and done, to go into the initial mash, what's called the mash. Of that, about 10 pounds, no matter what you're doing, probably about 90% of it is going to be straight 2-row barley. Just it's been malted, and that's it. Then you add lesser amounts of other different grains, depending on what style of beer you're brewing and depending on what kind of character you want the beer to have. So there's something called crystal malt, which is basically just malted barley that is then heated to various levels. What that's going to do is make it a little darker. It starts to caramelize some of the sugars in the barley, and so you can get you know, different flavors to come out of the barley. And so basically you can get anything from just lightly toasted all the way up to completely roasted barley, which is black. And that's going to be like for your stout beers, porters, things like that. Of course, wheat. Now, I said 90% of the beer is usually a base malt. The exception to that would be a wheat beer. But wheat beer is not exclusively wheat. Wheat actually doesn't have the correct enzymes to convert sugars into their fermentable forms. So you have to add a certain portion of barley to wheat, even to make a straight wheat beer. Otherwise, it won't ferment. So sometimes oats go into it. If you guys have been to Free State and the oatmeal stout, that the oatmeal part of that is because of oats. And then there are literally probably hundreds of different kinds of grains that go into, or that potentially you could put into beers. Each one having a different character, whether it's different caramelizations. Some of them add to head retention. So there are certain grains that you can put in to make that head on the beer stay thicker. And part of what appealed to me as a younger person with all this was just how much you could do with it. And it's really your imagination is kind of the limit to what you can do. This is a picture of what malted barley looks like when it's crushed. And you have to crush it in order to be able to extract all the sugars out of it. So this is actually a picture of the malt sitting in a bucket in my house before I brewed. So I have a grain mill. Basically, a grain mill is two metal studded plates that the grain is passed through, and it just crushes it. You don't want to grind it like flour. You just want it to be crushed up because you want to actually keep some of the hulls intact because it helps with filtering after when you're going to extract all the liquid, which I'll get to in a little bit. All right, other things you can add to beer: honey, molasses, spices, sugar, fruit. Obviously, there's, like I said, the possibilities are endless. Most of the adjuncts, a lot of these honey, molasses, and the spices are often added before the beer is boiled with the hops. But sometimes for some beers, you actually wait until the very end and put it in. So it just depends on what your goal is and whether or not you want these things to add to the fermentation. Anything that goes in before you put yeast in is potentially going to get fermented, obviously. And anything that you want to stay intact, you put in right before you bottle it. Okay, so hops is the second ingredient. How many of you, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention from the beginning. If you have questions, feel free to stop me anytime. I don't mind the interruption. So, how many of you have seen hop plants? All right, so hop plants are a really big vine. And the part that we actually use off of the hop plant is the flower. And the really important part of hops is what's called lupulin, and it's in the pollen that's in the very middle of the hop plant. That's where all of the bittering chemicals come from. There are two major different acids that are inside the hop flower, which are alpha acids and beta acids. And the alpha acids are the ones that really contribute to the bittering qualities of the hop. Basically, you could ferment barley on its own. And what you would end up with is some kind of sweet nastiness. that would taste like alcohol. Okay. So hops, the purpose behind hops is to get all those floral smells and all that. It's to balance the sugars of the malt. And depending on how much hops you put in, the quantity of hops that you put in, the type of hop, and how long you boil it is going to determine how much balance or bitterness you get out of the hop. And I like really hoppy beers. I like IPAs. That's not everybody's jam, and I understand that. But so I tend to use a lot of hops in most of my beers. I didn't in this one because I'm sensitive to other people. But I brought some samples, by the way. I brought one sample, I guess I should. So there are many, many different varieties of hops from all over the world. Let me go forward just a little bit because I think I have a slide on this. This is a picture of hops. Those are those cone looking things of the flowers. And that's what you harvest and ultimately turn into what you put in the beer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. That's a picture of what hop plants look like. And this is clearly a commercial hop farm. That's not what they looked like at my house. Mine weren't that pretty. That's because I have a day job. So, and then this, I tried to move this slide later in the presentation, but I'll just talk about it now. Hops can be used as the whole flowers, but more often for commercial use, they're actually pelletized. So basically they pulverize them and concentrate them down and pressurize them into a pellet. It makes them more shelf stable. It also makes them easier to transport. To buy an ounce of whole hop flowers is a pretty big bag, and an ounce of pelletized hops is about that big. So that's what an ounce of pelletized hops looks like. Those happen to be Chinook hops, which is just a certain variety. All right. There are brewers that will argue that water is the most important ingredient in beer. And if you know anything about water chemistry, which you guys are gardeners, so you probably know something about water chemistry. It can be really complicated. You can actually find in brewing software and online, you can find water profiles for pretty much every city in the country. And so there are guys who, when they brew beer, if they're going to brew a West Coast pale ale, they will modify their water to make it look like the water of Chico, California. So that it's absolutely authentic. I don't have time for all of that. I understand the chemistry, but that takes a long time to do. So, and you know, it involves a lot of math too, which, I mean, I'm good at math, but I don't enjoy it. So basically the things that are important about the water are going to be whatever its mineral content is, you know, things like sodium, magnesium, potassium. Those things are really important because yeast require them to be active. So if you took, there are some people who make the mistake of thinking I should use distilled water because it doesn't have any bacteria or anything in it. The problem with that is yeast won't work very well because it doesn't have the nutrients that it needs out of the water to be able to propagate and ferment correctly. You can use distilled water, but you have to basically add all of the minerals to it before you use it, or else it just won't work. And the pH is really important too. And that's primarily because the very first step of brewing, when you extract all these fermentable sugars from the grain, that process is very much affected by the pH of the mash. So you have to shoot for a slightly acidic pH, about 5.4-ish is the sort of ideal mash pH. So, which usually, I don't know if it's luck or if I'm just good, probably luck. Mine are usually right around 5.4. So, and I really think it's luck because I'm not that good. All right, finally, yeast. There are hundreds of different yeast strains. Many of those are actually commercially available. They're actually, I used to use a yeast called California ale yeast from a lab called White Labs, or I'm sorry, White Yeast. I don't know why they call it Y yeast. It's actually W and then the word yeast, but it's pronounced Y yeast. They made this yeast strain called California ale yeast, and that actually is the most common strain that Free State uses in most of their beers. So the cool thing for all of us who do this as a hobby is that we actually do have access to a lot of the same things that the big brewers do. And most of the craft brewers, if you ask them really nicely, they'll actually give you stuff. So if you get to know them and are really nice to them, they'll even give you a little bit of yeast out of there. Because the thing about yeast is that if you know how to do it, you can actually perpetuate it forever. What you do is after it's fermented, all the yeast settles to the bottom. If you then collect that and put it back into a growing medium, it'll just keep growing forever. Unless something happens to it, you know, it gets infected or something. So you can literally keep it going forever if you know what you're doing. Yeast comes in different forms. Dry yeast, everybody knows about that. That's just like your yeast that you use to make bread. It literally looks exactly the same. It's not, obviously it's a different strain of a yeast, but that's what it looks like. Basically, the yeast has been dehydrated and put into a little pelletized form. But you also can get liquid yeast preparations for home brewing. There's advantages and disadvantages to both of those. Dry yeast is more shelf stable. It lasts longer. But and actually it's probably easier to use. If there are some people who literally just take dry yeast and dump it in the fermenter dry. And I'm told that it works just fine. I have a background in biology, and that makes me nervous. So I usually rehydrate my yeast. And sometimes I actually make what's called a yeast starter, where I put some of I put the dry malt extract into a flask and actually get the yeast going before I pitch it, which I feel like makes the yeast start fermenting faster and work a little bit better. But that's completely an individual choice. The advantage to liquid yeast is that you don't have to do any of that because it's already in liquid yeast form. The disadvantage is that it doesn't have to form. That's what a typical package of a dry ale yeast looks like. And this is what I used to make this beer that I brought today. Okay. So step one, this is what we call the mash. And basically the grain is crushed. It's mixed with a certain volume of water at a certain temperature to achieve a certain temperature range that we're going to let it sit at for about 45 minutes to an hour. And what that does is pulls, it's like making tea. It steeps and it pulls all of the fermentable sugars out of the grain into the liquid. There's also some enzymatic processes that are happening at that time that starts to convert the starches into fermentable sugars. Okay. This is a picture of my mash. So it's all sitting in the kettle. You see the bubbles on top. That's just the enzymatic process happening. And what that, if you were to taste it at this point, after it was done, it would taste like sweet. I don't know what to compare it to. Almost like honey, actually. So after the beer is steeped or mashed, you run hot water over it, usually somewhere around 170 degrees. And you run water over it to basically wash all of the sugars out of the grain. That's called sparging. I don't know where they come up with these names. I would just call it washing, but there's really sophisticated ways to do this. You can get something called a sparge arm that actually like rotates around the beer, and it's supposed to prevent channeling and all this stuff. That's fine. If you want to do that, good for you. But you can certainly do it without all that stuff, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. So at this point, once you collect all of the liquid out of the grain, it's called wort. That word is pronounced wort. And so basically that's what you're going to take and mix with hops to then add the bittering process. And so you collect the liquid, you sparge it or wash it and collect all of that. And usually I shoot for a beginning volume of somewhere around 6.5 gallons or so. So that my ending volume is somewhere close to 5.5. Because obviously some will boil off when you boil it. So then once we've collected all of that, we take the hops, depending on how long you're going to boil the hops with the wort. Usually for most of my beers, I have a certain hop that's going to boil the whole time. And then I'm going to add hops in at varying intervals, depending on what kind of aromas and flavors I want. Basically, the longer you boil it, the more bitter it will make the beer, or the more balance you'll get. If you want your beer to smell really florally, you only boil that for a few minutes. And then the flavor profile is somewhere in between all that. So usually I have a 60-minute hop addition, and then I have usually like a 10-minute hop addition. That gets me what I want most of the time. So this step is really important in commercial breweries. They do this in a very sophisticated way. I actually have the tool that helps me do it really quickly. There are varying ways to do this. Basically, you want to try to cool it as quickly as possible. The reason for that is the longer that the wort stays at a higher temperature, it's going to keep converting whatever hops and things are in it. If it takes a long time to cool, if you wanted to get aroma out of your hops, you're going to lose it, because it's going to stay hot enough for long enough that it's going to extract more of those things, those alpha acids out. And you're going to end up with a really bitter beer. So I have what's called a counterflow chiller, which basically runs, yeah, okay, so here's the slide. So wort comes in one side, and it goes through a series of copper plates while water is running the other direction. And so what this little tool does is takes beer from boiling, so 212 degrees Fahrenheit, down to about 70 in about 3 minutes. And when you turn the water on at the faucet, it's coming out, it feels cold, usually it's somewhere around 70 degrees or so. When it's coming out the other end after it's gone through this thing, it is hot, really hot, because it has pulled all of the heat from the beer into the water. It's actually a really cool thing. I'd love to open that thing up and see the inside of it, but they cost about $150, so I'm not going to do that. And then it's collected into a fermenter. I use 6.5 gallon carboys. You can spend all kinds of money and get nice stainless steel cone fermenters, and that's great. Maybe one day I'll do that, but right now these work just fine for me. And this is what I actually do the fermenting. Yeah, it's glass. Yep. And the reason they actually do make plastic fermenters. Nobody I know uses them, because we all feel like it's going to really impart flavors to the beer, / be really hard to sanitize. Just because it's too pitted and there's too much potential to hang on to stuff. So I don't know anybody that uses them, but they make them. All right. For whatever reason, again, homebrewers are funny people. Brewers in general, we have to have words for everything. So putting yeast into the fermenter is called pitching. I've never pitched it. But so basically, once you get it down to that fermentation temperature, you put the yeast into the fermenter. And actually, a step that I have done for a number of years now before I do this is that I actually oxygenate the wort. So you're supposed to get oxygen into it somehow. Most people just shake it up really hard. I have found that if you go to the hardware store and get a little bottle of oxygen, and a little diffuser that you can connect to that, which homebrew shops are more than happy to sell you. You can actually very quickly put a lot of oxygen into it. When I started doing that process, the time to fermentation went from probably around 36 hours to more like 5 or 6 hours. Yeast really like oxygen, and they really like nutrients. And I just found that, I don't know if the end product is any different, but it makes me feel better. So, and so the fermentation process takes at least 2 steps. You basically let it sit and start fermenting, and that process becomes very obvious because it starts bubbling and it actually gets really vigorous. And sometimes if you have a little bit too much in the fermenter and you don't watch it, it'll actually ferment out of the top of the lock. Maybe that's happened to me once or twice. So it gets pretty vigorous in the first 3 days or so, and then it slows down. And once it slows down, what I do in my process is I actually like to pour the liquid off. So that first step is called a primary fermentation. Then I take the liquid off of the sediment that's drained, because there'll be sediment in the bottom of the fermenter at that point. And then I do what's called a secondary fermentation for about a week or so. The reason for that is that if you leave beer over the sediment for too long, or if you leave the wort over the sediment for too long, it can potentially make it skunky. And so as long as you don't let it sit on top of it for more than a week, usually it's okay. But I usually just do it when the very vigorous fermentation in the beginning has stopped. You'll transfer enough yeast to continue doing the job, and then you don't run the risk of imparting any undesirable flavors to it. And then once that process is done, you either have to bottle it or keg it. I keg it because it's easier. Bottling, I've done. It takes a very long time. It's really tedious. It works. You certainly can do it. I've been doing this for a long time. So over the years, I've evolved through several different iterations of how I do this. But what I've kind of arrived at is I just use what are called Cornelius kegs. They're the old 5-gallon kegs that pop used to come in, like in the 80s when I was a kid. And they work really well for home brewing. That's what most serious home brewers use, because it's a little bit of an investment in the beginning, but once you have it, and man, it beats bottling by a mile. And usually, if you have friends like mine, you might as well keg it anyway. Because everybody's favorite beer is a free beer. And they all tell you how great it is. Don't matter if it is or not. So it's not going to last long. So I just keg it. Okay. So that's beer. Now, mead. Does anybody know what mead is? So mead is a honey-based, almost like wine. Basically, it was actually, if I'm not mistaken, it was the first alcoholic beverage that was ever made, and probably by accident. If you've ever been to the Renaissance Festival, it's big at the Renaissance Festival. That's because, being historically accurate, mead was first, even though nothing at the Renaissance Festival is historically accurate. Since most people are walking around in middle-age dress, not Renaissance, but I digress. And actually mead is a lot easier to make. So basically all you do with mead is heat up some water, and you don't even have to boil it. Honey, very famously is antiseptic and antibacterial, and you don't have to do anything to it really. So you heat up water basically enough that you will kill any bacteria that are in the water that exists, which you don't, basically you have to get above like 170 for 5 minutes. And that should do the trick. And then you mix in honey with the water. And then you bring the volume up to 5 gallons and you pitch the yeast. I mean, it couldn't be simpler. I do a little bit more than that because I steep some other stuff into mine. And that's just because, I don't know, I just like to do that. You can get really complicated with mead. I mean, you can put all kinds of things into it, but basically you have made mead if you ferment honey. And so and the simplest meads out there are just honey, water, and yeast. Then there's a technically fruit mead. So if you put fruit into mead or fruit juices or things like that, that actually changes its name. And now you've made a melomel, which I have done on a number of occasions. I made a huckleberry mead that actually went to the national finalist competition at the American Homebrewers Association a number of years ago. And so that's all fun, but making mead is really, really simple. And the funny thing about mead in my life is that the reason I started making mead in the first place was that my wife, who really liked white wines, used to be really triggered, migraine triggered from wine. And so I started making mead, so that she could have it and not get migraines. Because it's usually the sulfites in the wine that trigger migraines. And there aren't any sulfites in mead. Now, since then, that has thankfully not, it's no longer a trigger for her migraines much. So, but that's how I got into making meads in the first place. And there are some really, really great meads out there. If you guys have ever been to Weston, Missouri, there's a meadery there called Purtle. They make really good mead. So if you're ever over there, check them out. Okay, growing hops. Hops are actually really simple to grow. Yeah, so here was the slide I was looking for earlier. So typically they're grown in more temperate climates. Very famously, there are hop varieties that come from the Czech Republic, Germany, obviously, and then the Pacific Northwest. So the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, there's a place called the Yakima Valley. That's where just huge amounts of hops come from. It's the Yakima Valley. There are like hundreds of hop cooperatives up there. And that's probably where that picture came from, actually, would be my guess. But you can grow them in a lot of other places. And there are people who grow hops here in Kansas, and there are actually a few people in Kansas who grow it commercially, believe it or not. So when you decide you want to grow hops, what you'll do is order hop rhizome. And I know that you guys are very familiar with what that is. They come in a little plastic bag soaked in a little bit of water. You take them out, put them in the ground. And when I tell you you don't have to do much to them, I mean you don't have to do much to them. They grow like weeds. They really do. Hops can grow really, really fast. And in fact, they can grow up to about 18 to sometimes 36 inches a day. They don't do that here, but mine would grow anywhere between 6 and 12 inches a day when I was still doing it. I actually don't grow hops anymore because of my schedule. But Once they start to sprout, you train them around string or rope or whatever you want to use, cable, so that they'll go up, and grow upward. And if you don't do that, obviously you'll just have this mess of stuff that you won't be able to do anything with. But they will grow 20 feet high pretty easily. Oops. Once they're pretty well established and several feet high, most people who grow hops, well, especially commercially, they'll remove the first couple of feet of leaves for pest control and fungal, to discourage fungal growth and that sort of stuff. And I started doing that after a few years, and I think it does help. So hops are a perennial. So and believe me, once you have them, you'll have a hard time getting rid of them. Basically, I used to kind of I'll have a picture here in a little bit of what my setup was, but I did them in an elevated planter, just for ease of weeding and that sort of stuff. I would cover that over the winter, and then when basically right around springtime, I would pull it off, and as the temperatures are warming, and once you start to see the sprouts, I mean, it's not going to be long. They grow quick. And after they've grown for a couple of months, then you start to see the hop cones. And basically the way you know they're ready to be harvested is that the cones will start to open up and you'll be able to see the pollen inside. When they're first growing, they're really tight. They look like it's like a pine cone. I mean, it works exactly the same way as a pine cone. When pine cones first grow, they're really tight and closed. And then as they get ready to fall off, they start to open up. Same exact thing. And that usually happens around here sometime in August or September, depending on what the climate has been like that particular year. Obviously, there's a number of ways you can fertilize hops. I used mushroom compost. That's all I put on it. And they just went crazy. So they're really, really easy. They do take a little bit of tending because you have to train them and all that, but just getting them to grow is really easy. So this was my setup. This was the elevated garden. I don't know if you can see these little things in here. Because I'm me, I decided to put a watering system in it. So that's actually a little bubbler head, and I would just hook a hose up to the side of the planter where I had a female end of a hose connected to PVC pipe under there, and then I would turn it on and it would water the plants so that they didn't get, similar to how you would do tomatoes and things like that. And it worked great. There's another picture. You can see them a little bit better there. There's the lines going up. So when I first did this, and I looked and looked and looked for pictures because I wanted you guys to see how janky my system was. I had PVC. I had 2x4s with PVC pipes going up and coming across the top, and then wires coming down from that, and it was janky. It got blown down in a storm. Actually, I made a beer that I called Wobbly Trellis because of my system, which was very appropriate. And the biggest problem was that we had this barred owl that kept perching on top of it. And he would break that thing like every other day. I just got tired of it. So I just ran him up to the side of my house. So that's where the lines are going that you see now. So I talked about this. When you harvest them, the flowers are collected. Once you get the hops harvested, you have to do a little bit of preparation to them to get them ready to use, which basically involves drying. And all I did was I put them on food dehydrators. which worked really, really well. And I would just dry them out and then throw them in a bag, and I measured them out into 1 ounce quantities and vacuum sealed them. And then basically they'll stay stable for several months at that point. And it worked really well. I never had a problem with it at all. So you can do that with whole hops. You can use pelletized hops, like I mentioned earlier. Then there's some other things that breweries have made popular. There's something called dry hopping, which means after you've fermented and before you keg or bottle, for a few days, you just put hops into the fermenter. And so what that's going to do is it's really just going to contribute floral notes to the beer. You're not trying to get any bitterness or anything like that out of it. You're just trying to get that really flowery, piney smell into the beer. And then there's something called wet hop, which I think it's a marketing ploy. I'm sure that some brewer would tell me why it's important. Basically, what that means is you use the hops like the day you harvest. You don't dry them out. You don't do anything. You pull them off the plant and you brew with them. I have no idea what that does. I've had wet hopped beers. I feel like they taste like any other beer. But like I said, I'm sure there's somebody who can tell you why it's important. But literally, like the breweries, the craft breweries who are going to do these wet hopping, they will literally like partner with a hop grower and say, okay, I'm going to do this beer, so I need you to call me like the day before you harvest so that I can prepare, and so that when you pull them off the plant, I can have somebody there to get them so we can put them in. It's pretty crazy. Free State did it at least once that I know of. So Charlie Papazian's tagline, which he says probably about 100 times in his book, is "Relax, don't worry, have a homebrew." Home brewing it can be very as complicated as you want, but it can also be really simple. And at the end of the day, I mean, I've made probably hundreds of beers. I've had 2 that I had to throw out that were just undrinkable. One of them was because it got a bacteria in it. It had some really bad off flavors that I'm sure were bacteria. The other one was because it was my first batch and I didn't know what I was doing. So it's very fun. I enjoy it. I really enjoyed growing hops when I did it. Like I said, I don't anymore, and that's just because my job changed and I got very, very busy. But I wouldn't be surprised if I do it again someday. So that's all I have. If you guys have questions or yeah, go ahead.
How big is your operation?
And could you repeat the question?
So the question was, how big is my operation? It is in a unfinished room in my basement. and I have homebrewers are pretty resourceful people usually. You can buy all of the stuff that you need commercially to make beer, and it can be really fancy and very expensive. Or you can do what I did, which was I needed a way to move beer by gravity from one thing to another. So I built an elevated brew stand out of the diamond plate running board of an old fire truck. Oh, so I literally welded this thing together and used Cajun boiler, stove for the heating source. And I start on the top, and once I get the water heated up, I pull it down. I just let it flow down through. I did spend a little bit of money on the brew kegs so that I could have all the hoses attached and ways to move it. But you could literally, if you wanted to, which I did for a while, pull the thing down and pour it in. Now, the reason I stopped doing that is that I burned myself pretty bad once. And so it's just, I spent money to make it safer. But you can do it really, really cheaply. That counterflow chiller I have is really, really nice. What I did before I had a counterflow chiller was I had a friend who had a long piece of coiled up copper pipe that he didn't want to use anymore. And I attached 2 hoses to it and ran water through the copper pipe and cooled it down that way, just exactly the same way that a moonshiner would do. And in fact, I think my nosy neighbor probably thinks I'm making meth when I do it. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I grew Cascade. I also grew, I tried to grow something called East Kent Goldings hops, but East Kent Goldings hops, but they never grew. Well, they grew, but they never flowered. I don't know why. But I did Cascade, I did Chinook, the ones that I showed you in the package. And so the primary reason that I did those 2 was they are really, really versatile hops. So I was looking to grow hops that I could use in a lot of different beer styles. And they happen to be very good at just the basic bittering of beer. So the balancing of the maltiness of the beer. So I grew them simply so that I would have a hop that I could use for a variety of different things. Mhm. Mhm. The only way you can measure the IBUs, truly measure the IBUs, is if you have somebody who has the right equipment to measure it with. I believe that you would need, a mass spectrometer. But I'll tell you, there are pretty good ways of estimating. There is something called, what's the software I use? I'm drawing a blank right now. There's a program that I use to help design beers. And there's a tool in there that helps you estimate what your IBUs are. And so basically what it does is it takes into account what hop you have, what the average alpha acid content of that hop is, and then how old it is. So you basically, as long as you know when you harvested it and what type of hop it is, you can pretty fairly estimate what the IBUs would be. With that program, it's called Brew. Beersmith, thank you. Thank you very much. It's Beersmith is what it's called. Yeah. I never really worried about it too much, to be honest with you, because I'm not trying to, I'm just a hobbyist, so I'm not putting my product out there. So for me it's not important that I know what my IBUs are, as long as it tastes okay. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that would be next level for sure. I think it's cool. I hope you do. And if you figure out how to do it, let me know. Basically, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Water, and I remember all the jingles, the Rock Mountain spring water and from the land of sky blue water, but do you just use plain tap water?
I just use tap water. City of Lawrence tap water. I technically live in Lecompton, but we get our water from the city of Lawrence, so. It's Craw River beer. You got it. And you know what? I've never had a problem. Like I said, I actually, the couple of places where I geeked out on my beer is I have a tool that allows me to measure pH. So I have a pH meter. And I have another tool that allows me to measure the specific gravity. Which on the spot, I'm forgetting the names of these things. Yes, thank you. It's a refractometer. I have a refractometer, which is a really cool device. There's other ways you can do it. You can do it with a hydrometer where you just, put the whole into a big graduated cylinder and let it settle out. That's cool too, but it's a whole lot simpler to use a refractometer. Yeah, go ahead.
So, wasn't available. But Dogfish Head has like three, they call 60, 90, and 120. Enjoy the beer. I don't know what 60, 90, 120.
I suspect, and I don't know this for sure, but I suspect that it has to do with crystal malt that they're using in it. So there's a measurement called Levibond, which is a measurement of how caramelized the barley is. So that when I was talking about taking barley and then toasting it or roasting it, the various levels that I was referring to, that's called Levibond. And you can get anywhere from 10 to 120 Levibond. And so before you get to like roasted barley, which is way beyond. But I suspect that's what that's referring to. I'm inferring from what I know, but I would guess that's probably what it is. It's either that or it could be IBUs, although 120 IBUs would be undrinkable. So I bet it's referring to. IBU stands for International Bittering Units. So it's just a unit of measure to quantify how much bitterness a hop is putting into the beer.
Are bitters type of beer?
No, that's something totally different. Yeah.
Two questions specifically on fresh hops.
Mhm.
Fresh hops. Tried once last year, and I'm pretty sure we let the hop cones stay open too long. How do you know when's the right time to go on hop?
Measure it with your heart.
Question?
I'm not trying to skirt your question. It really is experience. I'm sorry. So the question was, how exactly do you know when to harvest the hops? Basically what I did was when I could see the lupulin pretty much throughout the cone, that's when it was time to go. They're just open. If you let them get like this, that's too far. And I don't know how to make it any more sophisticated than that.
No.
Second
one is related. What's the conversion factor if I'm planning to brew between dry hops and fresh hops? Or how do you decide? So much.
Yeah. So the question is, what's the conversion factor for if you're going to dry hop versus put it in the boil?
Conversion factor
of quantity?
No, pellet hops versus fresh.
Oh, pellet hops versus fresh hops. I would use the same amount. Obviously the pelletized hops is going to be a much lower volume because it's concentrated, but an ounce of flowered hops is the same as an ounce of pelletized hops. I never use different quantities when I do it. Yeah,
Question here is, how do you control the fermentation?
so I'm really lucky in that the room that I brew in keeps it at a constant temperature. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. So the question is, how do I control the fermentation temperature? I'll address how I do it and then how it can be done. I'm really lucky because the room that I ferment my stuff in stays at a very constant temperature, and I've never had to do anything to it. It ferments just fine without doing anything. And that's because I'm brewing beers most of the time that are ales, which ferment at about room temperature, 70 to 74 degrees, something like that. Now, I do have the capability of lagering, which lagering is when you ferment at a lower temperature for a longer period of time. And the way that I do that is I have a refrigerator that has an external thermostat attached to it that I can actually dial into a specific temperature. And then the beer just goes into that refrigerator. It's a really old, this refrigerator is probably from the 60s. And so usually lagering is done somewhere around 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And so for the lower temperature, I can do it that way pretty easily, because I can control what temperature the refrigerator's at. Now, if you're trying to ferment in a room that is colder and you need heat, there are things that you can get that wrap around fermenters to heat them up. That would be the sophisticated way to do it. The home brewer way would be to use a heating pad and babysit it. But you could certainly do that and it would work just fine. It's just, you'd have to babysit it a lot more because you'd have to monitor the temperature. Now, in terms of monitoring the temperature, either you would need an infrared. I mean, I would recommend that you use an infrared thermometer so you don't have to get into the fermenter. Otherwise, you're going to have to really sterilize your thermometer every time you put it in there, or else you're going to ruin your beer. And that would not be ideal. I mean, honestly, if you're in and out of the beer more than a couple of times, you're probably going to do something to it. So, does that answer the question?
I believe so.
Okay. But they make I forget what they call it, but it's a series of like little heating elements that go around the fermenter, and you can turn it on and it will heat it up slowly. I mean, it's not like it's on a burner or anything like that, but it'll bring it up. So you can do that. I just have never had to. So that's done just by how much, what your specific gravity is when you start. So how much sugar you put into it, and how much, what the percentage of your fermentation is. So in other words, whatever you start with, the sugars you start with, you take a specific gravity reading. And then if you ferment it all the way down, so if you start at 1.060, what's the unit for specific gravity? I can't remember. Then if you ferment it all the way down to 1.0, which is what water is, then that would be 100% fermentation. Well, you never get 100%. But so if you take the starting specific gravity and the ending specific gravity, there's a calculation that you use to know how much alcohol's in it. And in the real world, in my world, I use Beersmith and it does it for me. But there's a formula for it if you had to do it by hand, in order to know how much you get. But so it all comes from how much sugar you start. And so the more sugar you have in the beginning, the higher the specific gravity will be. And so the higher potential alcohol content will.
So, thank you very much, and I think we are on.
Thank you.
How do you learn this?